The origin of humans. Did we evolve, or were we made in the image and likeness of God? Our roadmap through this talk will be this. A history of apeman. What has been the track record of the evolution scenario? Then we'll look at 3 individual case studies. We'll look at Neandertals, Australopithecines and Lucy. Then we'll look at a new apeman in our tree. Then we'll finish up with the mechanism for change. So, looking for evidence. If the evolution of humans from an ape-like ancestor is true, then there should be at least 2 lines of proof. Number 1, we should find the fossil record. We should find an abundance of fossils leading from an ape-like creature on up to humans. And secondly, there must be some mechanism to cause all this change. Some mechanism that will add all this new information to our DNA to evolve from an ape-like creature to human. Now, if these evidences are absent, then the only alternative is we were created in the image and likeness of God. So let's start with the history of man. Evolution begins with the assumption that we have evolved. We've evolved from some ape-like creature. So when you see these pictures up there, you can pick out which one of them is your relative. However, the Bible teaches something very different. The Bible teaches this right out of Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female. Only one of these 2 histories can be correct. If we have evolved, then the Bible is wrong. However, if the Bible is true, we were created in the image and likeness of God, then evolution has to be false. So let's take a look at what some of our school textbooks have to say about evolution. Now here's a very modern biology textbook, 1998, called Visualizing Life. And here's what they teach out of this textbook. And it starts off with, look closely at your hand. You have 5 flexible fingers. Animals with 5 flexible fingers are called primates. So right there, they're calling you a primate. Then they go on to say this. Monkeys, apes, and humans are examples of primates. Primates most likely evolved from small, insect-eating, rodent-like mammals that lived about 60 million years ago. Now notice what they're saying here. What they're saying is your great-great-great ancestor was not a scoundrel. They were a rodent. In other words, you have rats in your family. Now here's another biology textbook. Again, another modern biology textbook, year 2000. And here's what they're teaching out of that textbook. But all researchers agree on certain basic facts. We know, for example, that humans evolved from ancestors we share with other living primates such as chimpanzees and apes. Now, did you notice any fuzzy or wrong words in this statement out of the textbook? Did you notice the word all? But all researchers agree. Now, there are thousands of scientists that do not agree with evolution. There are thousands of scientists out there that believe exactly what the Bible teaches, that God has created us in his image and likeness. Now, either the writers of these textbooks have not done their research, or they are deliberately not telling the truth. Also notice the words in there, certain basic facts. That again is not true. There are no facts of evolution. So our textbooks are not teaching real science here. But what I want to do is take a look at some of these facts of evolution. Let's look at the historical track record of these facts of evolution. And let's start with Java man, also called Pithecanthropus erectus. Now Java man, parts of it were found in 1891. What did they find? An ape-like skull cap. Then a year later, 1892, they found a human-like thigh bone about 40 feet away. Now get this. We found an ape-like skull cap. And 40 feet away, a year later, we found a human-like thigh bone, leg bone. Well, it's only 40 feet. Let's put the 2 together. We got part ape, we got part human, put them together, we now have apeman, and it was claimed to be 500,000 years old. Now, how do they know it was 500,000 years old? They didn't have any dating mechanisms back then. No radiocarbon-14 dating, no radioisotope dating. Well, the answer to that question is, that's what they wanted it to be. Now, one of the leading scientists at the time, Rudolf Virchow, he's regarded as the father of modern pathology. So he understands human anatomy very well. And he stated this at the time of the discovery about Java Man. And he says, in my opinion, this creature was an animal, a giant gibbon, in fact. The thigh bone has not the slightest connection with the skull. His expertise was ignored, and it is still ignored. Dubois, for many years, refused to let anybody else see his fossils. Then in 1907, several other scientists went on an expedition back to Java to find some more clues, to see if they could verify Java Man. They found no more bones, but what they did discover was maybe those lava flows in the nearby vicinity were relatively recent, and maybe these bones were not 500,000 years old. But that information was also ignored. Now, Dubois insisted that Java Man was not a man, but a creature intermediate to the gibbons and humans. Now, what have we done with Java Man today? Well, since the 1950s, anthropologists and our school textbooks have been calling Java Man Homo erectus, upright walking man. So they've lumped Java Man into the Homo erectus category. Now, let's take a look at another famous fact of evolution, Piltdown Man. Now, Piltdown Man, parts were found between 1908 and 1912 in Piltdown, England, hence the name Piltdown Man. What did they find? They found a portion of a human skull and some ape-like jawbone and teeth. Now, hold on now. We got part human, part ape, put them together. What do we have? We've got another ape man. And it was claimed to be 500,000 years old. Now, wait a minute again. How did they know it was 500,000 years old? We didn't have any dating methods back then. That's what they wanted it to be. That's the level of science we're looking at here. 500,000 years old. How famous was Piltdown Man? Well, almost every scientist in the world that believed in evolution bought into the fact of Piltdown Man. New York Times even ran an article back then stating this: Darwin theory proved true. It was featured in textbooks and encyclopedias for over 40 years. But in 1953, several scientists went back to look at the real bones. And what they discovered was this: the bones had been chemically stained to make them appear old, and the teeth had file marks on them to make them fit. The whole thing was a fraud to begin with. What had happened was somebody got some bones, went out there, chemically stained them, buried them, and somebody who believed in evolution found these bones and immediately claimed the intermediate link without doing any real scientific study. The truth was, Piltdown Man was not 500,000 years old. It is believed to only be about 600 years old. Well, let's go to another famous fact of evolution, Nebraska Man. Now, anybody know where Nebraska Man was found? Well, that's easy. It was found in Nebraska. See how easy paleontology is now, anthropology? Nebraska Man. Now, Nebraska Man was found in 1922. It's discovered in 1922. It attempted to use Nebraska Man in the famous Scopes trials, also nicknamed the monkey trials. Now, Nebraska Man was also claimed to be 1 million years old. Now, we should have a problem with that date right away. This was found in 1922. We did not have any dating methods until the 50s and 60s. So how did they know it was 1 million years old? Again, they didn't. That's what they wanted it to be. Now, they must have found an awful lot of this fossil to support Nebraska Man as an immediate link. Because sitting there in Lincoln, Nebraska, at one of the universities there, they had the complete Nebraska Man, his wife, his family, and the environment he lived in. The entire Nebraska Man and his family. Tremendous amount of fossil evidence to support this. So how much of the fossil did they find? A tooth. A single tooth. And from that single tooth, they were able to construct Nebraska Man, his wife, and his family, and the entire environment he lived in. Now, when they found the rest of the fossil that went with this tooth, they found it was not an ape's tooth. It was not a human tooth. It was a pig's tooth. It was the first time a pig ever made a monkey out of a man. Now, this next statement I like to say, except when I was teaching in Nebraska, is if this is what they're teaching in our university, specifically University of Nebraska, the fact of Nebraska man from a single pig's tooth, then what does the N stand for on their football helmets? And the answer is knowledge. Now, you have to know something about spelling to understand that. Well, let's go to another fact of evolution. Somebody called Ramapithecus. Pithecus, the Greek word for ape. Ramapithecus was discovered in the 1930s. What did they find? A few teeth and some jaw fragments. And from those few teeth and jaw fragments, this is the picture they drew and put in our textbooks to support the fact of evolution. Now, some more about Ramapithecus. Ramapithecus was claimed to be 14 million years old. Now, again, we should have a problem with that date right there because there was no dating methods back then. So how did they know it was 14 million years old? Again, they didn't. That's just what they wanted it to be. Do you see the accuracy of the evolution dating methods? Now, the truth was, in the 1970s, they discovered a baboon living in Ethiopia that had almost an identical jaw and tooth structure. Very similar morphological features. So Ramapithecus was really not 14 million years old. It could still be living today. So what have they done with Ramapithecus? It has been now dropped from the textbooks and is no longer one of these facts of evolution. So let's recap some of our facts of evolution. Java man, we believe, was nothing more than an extinct ape. Piltdown man was a hoax or fraud. Nebraska man was a pig. And Ramapithecus is an ape. So what about the dates? How accurate have we been doing in our dating methods? Well, in every single case, we were wrong. The evolutionists were wrong. So if they were to come out and find a new intermediate link tomorrow and advertise it through the news press, would we trust it? Well, not based on this track record. They have broken our trust repeatedly with false and misleading information. So now let's go to some more modern case studies. Let's do 3 case studies here. Those are all we've seen as the historical so-called facts of evolution that were proven false. Let's look at Neanderthals, Lucian Australopithecines, and a new guy called ramidus. And let's start with our Neanderthals. Who were they? What did they look like? Well, here's a drawing of the first picture put in the press to represent Neanderthals. Now notice this creature they put in there. Notice they put all this hair on it, and they constructed it to look very apish in appearance. The head so far forward of the neck it could not look upright, walking much like an ape. Now, a question I have. When we find these bones, do we find any hair with them? Do we find eyeballs or noses? No, we don't. So how did they know to draw this picture? The answer is they didn't. This is what they wanted it to look like. So what else do we know about these Neanderthals now? Well, they were first found in Dusseldorf, Germany, in the Neander Valley, hence their name, Neanderthals. They were originally constructed to look very ape-like. Now, one of the things evolutionists have used in the past to support the fact of evolution is brain capacity. The larger our brain capacity, the more we've evolved until, guess what? We've discovered about Neanderthals. On the average, they have a slightly larger brain capacity than we do. Now, after many years of misinformation, several scientists went to look at these bones. Some anatomists went to look at the initial construction of Neanderthal, and what they discovered was the bones had been put together all wrong. Again, deception to support evolution. When they reconstructed this creature, put the bones back together correctly, what they discovered was Neanderthal looked very much like you and I. Very little differences. Now, some more about Neanderthals. One, we know they use jewelry. Apes don't make and use jewelry. They use musical instruments. Apes don't make and use musical instruments. They did cave paintings. They were capable of speech. You know, we are the only species, humans are the only species on this planet capable of full speech. Other animals can do grunts and groans and mimic sounds, but humans, we are the only species. We are the only species have all the anatomy to do full speech. And guess what we found with Neanderthals? all the anatomy for full speech, just like modern human beings. Something else about Neanderthals? They buried their dead. Matter of fact, many of the Neanderthals we find are buried in caves. Does that make them a very archaic, evolving creature? No, it doesn't. You know, we have people living in caves today. They're not evolving. But it does show a very good sign of intelligence. Think of this. Where did Abraham bury Sarah in the Bible? In a cave. Where did most of the patriarchs bury their dead? In a cave. See, it was a very smart thing to do to bury your dead in a cave. You see, if you buried your dead out there in the open and put a marker there, it was very easy for the elements to wash that marker away, or for somebody to pick that marker up and take it away. But when was the last time any of you picked up a cave and took it somewhere? See, it was a very smart thing to do, to bury their dead in a cave. It gave them a permanent marker, permanent location to come back to. Now, some more about Neanderthals. The picture we're showing here is a picture of a fossil purchased over there in Berlin Museum. Now, I want to point something out, characteristic about ape-like creatures. In an ape-like creature, if you notice this picture here, from the top forehead going down to the chin, it kind of slants out a little bit. Notice in this picture, kind of slants out a little bit. That's very characteristic of ape-like creatures. Now, in humans, our face goes straight up and down. Straight up and down. Now, here's a test you can do. Here's a test you can do. Next time you're by a mirror, turn your face sideways and look out the corner of your eyes. And if your face tends to slant out a little bit like this, you might qualify as an intermediate link based on the evolution thinking. But I want to point something out about this fossil that's being sold over there in Berlin, out of the museums. Again, notice that structure in the skull, how it goes from top to bottom out. But notice where those arrows are pointing on the skull. One arrow points to a little knob, and the other arrow points to a little cavity where that knob is supposed to fit into. Now, one thing about this fossil they're selling over there, that little knob has been pulled out of that cavity by over an inch. Now, when it's constructed properly, look what that head looks like. Notice that face goes straight up and down. Are they selling the truth? No, they're not. Once again, the evolutionists are resorting to deception to support their model. Now, hold on. Any model that has to continually resort to deception and misleading information, can it be called a theory? Can it even be called science anymore? If evolution wants to call themselves a theory, if they want to call themselves scientific, they have to put the cards on the table and give the true science and stop giving misinformation. Now, some more about Neanderthal anatomy. One of the things we notice on many Neanderthals is they have this thick brow ridge above their eyebrows that kind of juts out a little bit. Just a little brow ridge that kind of juts out. Now, does that mean they're an evolving creature? No, it doesn't. You know, we have people today that have this brow ridge that sticks out. I've seen some people where it sticks out about 1/4 of an inch. They don't even need umbrellas. You see, they're not evolving. It has a lot to do with our environment we're living in and how we're chewing and what we're eating. See, certain times when we chew, it can cause compression, pushing up and up and up in the jaw and causing this bone to jut out a little bit. Many orthodontists have patients that have this bone jutting out based on the way their jaw is structured and how they're chewing. Causes this bone to jut out. Now, something else about Neanderthals. Many of the Neanderthals, not all of them, but many of them have kind of short, stocky build and shorter extremities. Shorter extremities meaning arms and legs. Does that mean they're evolving? No, it doesn't. We have people like that today. They're called the Inuits, the Eskimos. Now, what kind of a climate do these Eskimos live in? Cold, harsh climate. They're not evolving. They're 100% human beings. You see, when you live in a cold, harsh climate, a shorter, stockier build and shorter extremities protects you from the environment. You see, it causes you to give off less body heat. That is called natural selection. Our ability to adapt to our environment has nothing to do with evolution, has everything to do with natural selection, being able to adapt to your environment. Now, Neanderthals, were they human? Here's Dave Phillips, who happens to be a physical anthropologist. He states this: Neanderthals were human. They buried their dead, used tools, had a complex social structure, employed language, and played musical instruments. And then he says, Neanderthal anatomy differences are extremely minor and can, for the most part, be explained as a result of genetically isolated people that lived in a rigorous life in a harsh, cold climate. That is the conclusion. Neanderthals were an isolated population of people that lived in a cold, harsh climate. When did they live? Probably sometime after the flood during the Ice Age, because many of these Neanderthals we find are located in Ice Age Europe, where the Ice Age came down to. Cold, harsh climate. Some of the Neanderthals we find don't have all this anatomy, short, stocky build. Those are the ones we find that didn't live in the Ice Age Europe area. So again, it has everything to do with natural selection, our ability to adapt to our environment, but nothing to do with evolution. Now, something about Neanderthal population. I like to use numbers because I like to see if everything adds up properly. Now think of this. Common dates for Neanderthals, when they lived, was from about 100,000 years ago up to about 35,000 years ago. Now you can read a lot of different textbooks, and almost every textbook you read is going to give a different date. That right there disqualifies something about Neanderthals and evolution because nobody can agree. But we're going to use these dates. About 100,000 years ago to about 35,000. Now, Neanderthals, that means, existed for about 65,000 years on this planet. About 65,000 years they were roaming around this planet. That is about 2,600 generations of Neanderthals. Now, let's see if these numbers add up. From the year 1 to the year 2000, the population on this planet has grown from about 300 million to over 6 billion people. That is almost a 6 billion increase in population in just 2,000 years. And doing that in just 100 generations. Now let's see if these numbers add up. You see, if Neanderthals were living on this planet for over 65,000 years, there should have been easily over 50 billion Neanderthals that lived during that time period. Over 50 billion. So the question is, how come we can only find very few Neanderthal skeletons? Very few Neanderthal skeletons from over 2,600 generations. And how come we can find them only located in about 30 different sites? You see, with 50 billion Neanderthals living during that time, we should be stepping on these bones everywhere. Oh, but Mike, they don't survive, they don't fossilize. Well, wait a minute. The dinosaurs, according to evolution, are supposed to have died out 65 million years ago. They did not bury their dead. How come we can find so many dinosaur bones, but yet so few Neanderthal bones when they buried their dead and should have been well preserved? The numbers do not add up to support evolution. Where are all the fossil bones for Neanderthals? Now, science and education. Are the textbooks and the media presenting all the information? Well, so far we've seen they're not presenting all the information. See, if you receive only selected information, you're not being taught anymore. You're being indoctrinated, and that is what is happening in many of our public schools. And the question now is, why are textbook writers afraid of presenting all the information? And the answer is easy. Once you put all the scientific information in there, evolution cannot stand up against it. That is the only way they are protecting evolution in our education system today, by not putting all the information in there. So, conclusion on Neanderthals. One, many of them had a protruding brow ridge out here. We have people like that today. They had a short, stocky body build and short extremities. We have people like that today also. They were an isolated population of people. We have people like that. You know, any species you get that tends to be isolated, any population of any species that gets isolated tends to take on specific types of characteristics. And that is exactly what we see in the Neanderthals. We also see that many of them lived in a cold, harsh climate, and the results we have seen is Neanderthals were 100% human beings. So, review of evolution. The history of evolution. The history of their facts are mistakes and deception. Neanderthals, what we see in there is misinformation being given and deception. What does that tell us about evolution? Why can't the textbook writers, why can't the people who promote evolution simply just give the science and all the scientific information. Well, let's go to case study 2 then. Lucy and the Australopithecines. Now we're going to be fair. We've been talking about ape men so far. Now we're going to talk about ape women. And what we're saying here is you women also used to have to shave a bit too. Now, Australopithecines. Australopithecine means southern ape. Notice we find most of these creatures in South Africa area. And Lucy is one of these types of Australopithecines. And what do we know about Lucy? Well, Lucy was discovered in 1974 by Dr. John Johansson. And what he found was about 40% of this fossil, 40% of the creature. Claimed it was 3.5 million years old. And also claimed it was bipedal. Now, I don't know if any of you people out there are bipedal or not, but I'll give you a choice. If you're not bipedal, your only alternative is you're a knuckle walker. What we mean by bipedal is you can walk upright on 2 legs comfortably for long periods of time, like human beings. Apes don't have that characteristics. They can walk upright, but not for very long periods of time, and it's very uncomfortable. Now, he claimed it was bipedal. How did he know that? Well, he didn't. He only found 40% of the fossil. Now, does anybody know how Lucy got its name? That's a good question. Why did they call her Lucy? Well, when you find something, you get to name it. And at the time of the discovery of Lucy, there happened to be a song playing over the radio by this group called the Beatles, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds in Her Hair. So they said, well, that sounds pretty good. We'll call this creature Lucy. Again, you find something, you get to name it. Now, notice something about the picture I have here. Notice I have Lucy's foot circled there. The reason I'm going to do that, we're going to come back to that. But the reason I have the foot circled is we did not find any of Lucy's feet. Now, we have found other Australopithecines' feet. And in every single case, they looked almost identical to an ape's foot. But remember, we did not find Lucy's feet. So we're going to come back and have to discuss that for a moment. So let's look at some of the characteristics of Lucy. First of all, there's no similarity in appearance to humans. The long arms we found in Lucy and the Australopithecines are identical to chimpanzees. Now, here's another characteristic difference between humans and ape-like creatures. In humans, our arm is about 3/4 the length of our leg, or about 75% the length of our leg. Now, in ape-like creatures, their arm is about the same length as their leg. Now, Lucy was reported to be about 81% the length. The arm was about 81.9% the length of the leg. Now, that's pretty exact, pretty precise measurement when we didn't find all the bones. Now, here's another test you can do then. Measure the length of your arm, then measure the length of your leg. And if your arm comes out to be between 80 and 85% the length of your leg, then guess what you could be? You could be that intermediate length. Now, some more about Lucy. The jaws were similar to chimpanzees. The upper leg bone was similar to chimpanzees. Lucy's legs were very ape-like. Are we starting to see a pattern here about Lucy? Even the brain capacity we found on these Australopithecines and Lucy was well within the range of ape-like creatures. It had large back muscles, we believe, for tree dwelling. Hands similar to pygmy chimpanzees, and its feet were long and curved. Now, here's another characteristic difference between apes and humans. In humans, we have 4 fingers and a thumb. Now, notice our thumb has the capability to stick out like this. It doesn't always stick out like the rest of our fingers straight up. Why does our thumb have the capability to stick out like this? Well, easy. Makes it easier to pick things up with our hands, and we can swing from trees with our hands. Now, on our feet, our toes, our great toe sticks straight forward like the rest of our toes. Now, why doesn't our great toe have the capability to stick out like a thumb? Well, easy. We don't normally pick things up with our feet, and we don't normally swing from trees with our feet. But in ape-like creatures, their great toe has the capability to stick out more like a thumb. Why? Because apes generally pick things up with their feet, and they can swing from trees with their feet. Now, every single Australopithecine foot bone that we have found, their feet are identical to ape creatures, with the great toe sticking out like this. Now, this picture I'm showing here, I took directly out of a biology textbook, straight out of a biology textbook. And notice the foot there. Notice they have drawn this foot identical to a human foot. And this foot, this creature in the textbook, is labeled Lucy. Isn't that amazing? Every Australopithecine bone we found, where we found the foot bones, it was identical to an ape-like creature, the great toe sticking out like a thumb. But yet, our textbook writers continue to deceive the public by putting false information in the books. Any model that has to continually resort to misleading information and deception can no longer be called science. If they want to call themselves a scientific theory, they must be willing to examine all the science and give that information out to the public. Now, some scientists went to look at this. Anatomists, Jack Stern and Reynold Sussman, they went to look at some creatures they had drawn at a museum, at a zoo actually in St. Louis. And they looked at these textbooks, and this is what they had to say. Now, Jack Stern and Reynold Sussman, in 1983, a study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology described anatomy of Lucy's species Australopithecus afarenus. And this is what they had to say. They described Lucy's hands and feet as being long and curved, typical of tree-dwelling apes. Notice they were shocked when they saw this information in the textbooks. They were shocked when they saw this creature replica at a museum or zoo in St. Louis. They couldn't believe the misinformation being presented to the public. Again, why can't evolution just present the accurate science? Well, let's go. Did Lucy walk upright? The claims in our textbooks is Lucy could walk upright. But that claim still comes from the 1974 book written by Donald Johanson. The claim that Lucy could walk upright. Here's the up-to-date information. 1987, Charles Oxnard, who is a professor of anatomy and human biology, did a complete computer analysis, the most extensive study ever done on the Australopithecine bones. And his conclusion was, Lucy could not walk upright. In 1992, American Journal of Physical Anthropology concluded Lucy walked like a chimpanzee, not like a human. 1993, Christine Tardieu, an anthropologist, reported its locking mechanism was not present. See, in human beings, we have a locking mechanism in our leg, a locking mechanism in our knee joint here that allows us to stand upright comfortably for long periods of time. But apes don't have that, and we've never found that in any of the Australopithecines. Then in 1994, the Journal of Human Evolution, I just want to make sure you understand something, that is not a Christian magazine. They reported through biochemical studies of the hip and the thigh that Lucy could not walk upright. Not one bit of this evidence has been presented in our textbooks. They still continue to use outdated and wrong information to deceive the public and deceive our students. Now, did Lucy walk upright? Here's out of Nature magazine, the year 2000, and this is what they had to say. Regardless of the status of Lucy's knee joint, new evidence has come forth that Lucy has the morphology of a knuckle walker. There's even in Nature magazine they're admitting Lucy could not walk upright. Then in Science magazine, also the year 2000, we read this. I walked over to the cabinet, pulled out Lucy, and shazam! I like those science words. She had the morphology that was classic for knuckle walkers. Every area of science clearly supports Lucy could not walk upright, but yet our textbooks fail to put the science in there. That is called deception and indoctrination. Again, back to Charles Oxnard. Now he's professor of anatomy, and he's one of the leading experts in Australopithecine fossils. One of the leading experts. And this is what he has to say in his article, The Order of Man, a Biomathematical Anatomy of the Primates. The Australopithecines, known over the last several decades, are now irrevocably removed from a place in the evolution of human bipedalism. And then he says, all this should make us wonder about the usual presentation of human evolution in introductory textbooks. Isn't that amazing? The leading scientific researchers in this area clearly dispute the textbooks. But yet, the writers of these textbooks continue to ignore the science in order to deceive the public. So, conclusion on Lucy. William Fix, in his book, The Bone Peddlers, 1984. Now, something about this book. It's very hard to find this book anymore. Why? because it was taken off the market about a year after it came out. Why was it taken off the market? Well, in this book, William Fix talks all about the evolutionists and what they're doing to deceive the public. Talks all about the infighting between the evolutionists, how they can't even agree on what they have found. And the people promoting this evolution went to the publishers and said, take that book off the market. What do we call that? Censorship. Who's doing the censorship in this country? The evolutionists. Now, not all evolutionists. There's some very good evolutionists out there doing the best they can to do the real science. But in order to protect evolution, what we're finding is they will not present the evidence. And here's what William Fix put in his book. And he states, Lucy seemed to be more of a promotion to convince the public that Johansson's fossils were more important than Richard Leakey's, rather than an attempt to present an even-handed assessment of current paleoanthropology. Now, John Johansson is the founder of Lucy. And here we have the Leakey family, who have found many, many other famous intermediate links. And here they are fighting back and forth between themselves, saying, I have found the greatest fossil. And the Leakeys are trying to discredit the Johanssons, and Johansson's trying to discredit the Leakeys. That's why this book was taken off the market. So, science and education again. Are textbooks and the media presenting all the information? No, they're not. If you receive only selected information, are you being taught or indoctrinated? The answer to that is you're being indoctrinated. So again, why are textbook writers afraid of presenting all the information? The answer is easy. Because if you put all the scientific information in the textbooks, then evolution cannot stand up against it. So, review of what we've gone through. The history of evolutionary facts, we saw mistakes and deception. Neanderthals, we saw misinformation and deception. And Lucy, we saw misinformation and deception. Are we seeing a pattern here to the evolution model? And yes, we are. It is called deception. So let's go on to case study 3, ramidus. Let's take a look. What I want to do here with ramidus is look at the validity of the reported evidence. Now, call this another ape-man. It was announced in 1994. It's one of the newest ones to be in our textbooks, found in Aramis, Ethiopia. The name changed to Ardipithecus ramidus. And it was dated to be 4.4 million years old. The greatest new discovery, because now it's almost 1 million years older than Lucy. Time magazine, October 3rd, 1994, reported this. Bones from the Ethiopian desert prove that human ancestors walked on Earth 4.4 million years ago. Notice the word prove there. Didn't we see that back in the days of Piltdown Man? Proved, New York Times, proved theory, proved the fact of evolution. Then in Newsweek, October 3rd, 1994, ramidus confirms once and for all that the common ancestor lived just a little more than 4.4 million years ago. Now notice, Time Magazine, Newsweek, very popular magazines out there. Now, what did they find? Here are the 5 evidences used to support ramidus as being an intermediate link. First of all, it fits into the line of progression with all the other missing links. Second, the date of 4.4 million years old proves that it's an intermediate link. Third, the thickness of the enamel on the fossil teeth prove it was an intermediate link. The deciduous molar proves it was an intermediate link. And 5, it might have been bipedal, walking upright on 2 legs. Those are the 5 evidences used to support this as an intermediate link. Now, what was found? See, most of the public never saw or heard all the information about what was found. First of all, fossils were collected from a surface area of 17 different positions, 17 different areas. Fossils of ramidus were spread over a whole mile range. It wasn't found in just one nice, neat little pile. It was scattered over a whole mile. They found 8 teeth. Most were damaged. Parts of the base of the skull were found 500 meters away. That's about 1,500 feet. Fragmented arm bones were found 270 meters away. So the question we have to ask now is, does all this material belong to the same species? Does all this material belong to the same creature? And how would you know? You wouldn't know. So let's take a look at these 5 evidences. They reported 5 evidences, and this is what they commonly put in the textbooks. Well, let's evaluate, again, what they're not telling the public. See, evidence number 1 was it fits in the line of progression of all the other missing links. Now, this is often used as evidence. However, the validity of this line of evidence is not accepted by all evolutionists. You see, the lineup changes sometimes from year to year. Even in the same textbook, sometimes they'll have 2 different lines of progression. So let's take a look at some of these lines. Here's a biology textbook, a year 2001 biology textbook. And in the same textbook, they have 2 different lines of progression. Notice these pictures here. Notice one creature. It has a different age in the 2 different lines of progression. And notice the other creature is on a different line completely. Which one of these is the true line of progression? You see, even in the same textbook, they have multiple lines of progression. So how can we say ramidus fits in the line of progression when we don't have just one line of progression? We have multiple lines of progression. See, that doesn't work. Then here's another biology textbook, 2 biology textbooks. One is Biology Visualizing Life, Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, 1998. Now notice in that book, they have this one creature, Australopithecus boise, dated between 1.5 and 2 million years old. That was in 1998. When they updated their textbook in 2001, they have the same creature dated 500,000 years younger. Well, wait a minute. In just 3 years of our time, this creature aged or changed 500,000 years. Something is not right with their line of progression. How can we say it fits in the line of progression when there's multiple lines of progression and they're constantly changing from year to year? So, evidence 1, conclusion. How reliable is the line of progression? Well, different textbooks have different lines. The line changes from year to year, and evolutionists cannot agree on a single line of progression. So the line of progression is not evidence for human evolution. It's more what you would call a line of confusion. Let's go to evidence 2, the dating. They dated this fossil as being 4.4 million years old. What didn't they tell the public? Well, first of all, it was claimed to be the oldest hominid. That makes it a very famous one. You also notice there's no accurate dating method. Radiocarbon-14 dating, if it worked, couldn't go back beyond about 60,000 years, so it can't date it. All the other radioisotope dating methods give multiple different ages and are not accurate. The geologic context of the fossil was not even well established. And the starting point for the dating, first of all, they didn't know exact dating on this fossil. They didn't tell the public that. What they did was they used biochronological comparisons of fauna found in other areas. In other words, they found creatures in other areas, in a nearby area, where they found ramidus and said, oh, this creature over here must be about 4.5 million years old, therefore ramidus must be. Or this creature over here nearby must be about 4.5 million years old, therefore ramidus must be. See, they never told the public, they never directly dated this fossil. They just said, there's other creatures in the nearby area that are about this old, therefore ramidus must also be this old. That is deception. Now, how was it buried? Well, how did they find us? Well, Time magazine claimed the fossils were enclosed in sedimentary rock that were neatly sandwiched between layers of volcanic ash. Newsweek claimed the fossils were locked in 4.4 million-year-old sediment. The fossil discoverer stated all hominid specimens were surface finds. Do you see the inaccuracy of the reported information in our magazines even? See, it's assumed this is where the creatures died and they did not erode from some other place over the alleged million years. Remember, ramidus was found over an area of about a mile range. How in the world can they say over these 4.5 million years, all those bones stayed in that same location? Isn't it possible some bones had eroded from some other place? And this could be multiple different creatures? Well, let's go to evidence number 3, tooth enamel. The thickness of the enamel on the fossil teeth was used as proof of evolution. But Peter Andrews, Natural History Museum in London, disagrees with this interpretation. And he says, all other hominids, including modern humans, have relatively thick enamel. So the thin enamel of ramidus is more of what you'd expect from a fossil chimp. See, they didn't tell the public that. There's disagreement. Now, studies have shown that there are at least 3 factors that can affect the thickness of the enamel on our teeth. 1, genetic variation. 2, environmental. And 3, nutritional factors. All these scientific explanations were completely ignored in the evolutionist explanations. Once again, they're doing this thing called deception by omission. They're just leaving out the scientific explanations and just reporting evolution assumptions. So are we being given all the information? Once again, we're not. So let's go to evidence number 4, the deciduous molar. That's one of your young molars, one of your young molars. Here's a report out of Nature magazine, 1994. The deciduous molar one has been critically important in studies of Australopithecus since the discovery of the genus 70 years ago. The ramus deciduous molar one is morphologically far closer to that of a chimpanzee than any known hominid. That whole piece of evidence was also ignored. Why? Because the real science refutes evolution, and they will not report the scientific information. So let's go to evidence 5 now, bipedality. It was claimed that ramidus might have been bipedal, meaning it walks upright like a human being. Notice the word might in their description. You know, no foot, no leg, or no hip bone was found. So how did they know it was bipedal? They didn't. What they did was make a claim without providing any supporting evidence. Once again, that is called deception. Now, Nature magazine, 1994, several scientists writing made this claim describing the cranial fossil of ramidus. Strikingly chimpanzee-like in morphology. Describing the arm bones in the same magazine, these scientists said, a host of characters usually associated with modern apes. Almost everything we find about ramidus, matter of fact, everything we find about ramidus is completely ape-like in characteristics. So, conclusion about ramidus. All 5 evidences are based on deception. Evidence 1, line of progression. There's multiple lines of progression. Evolutionists can't even agree on that. Evidence 2, the dating. They never really dated the fossil. They just used other fossils to date this one. The tooth enamel. They forgot about scientific characteristics like environmental characteristics, nutritional characteristics. They just didn't report any of those. The deciduous molar turned out to be more like an ape-like creature. And bipedality, that was just an entire guess, but the public never heard that. Folks, when you're going to make a claim, you need to supply the real evidence. Great claims require real evidence, not deception. So let's go back and review what we've seen so far as the facts of evolution. Our history of evolution, we had mistakes and deception. Neanderthals, we saw misinformation and deception. Lucy and the Australopithecines, we saw misinformation and deception. And ramidus, we saw misinformation and deception. Are we starting to see a pattern to the evolution model here? How objective are our textbooks? Well, James Perloff wrote a book called Tornado in a Junkyard, and he states this. Most textbooks avoid showing comprehensive tables of the discovered human fossils. And he says, doing so exposes the contradictions. Evolution and objectivity. Philip Johnson, in his book Darwin on Trial, states this. The fossils provide much more discouragement than support for Darwinism when they are explained objectively. But objective examination has rarely been the object of Darwinist paleontology. And he concludes, the Darwinist approach has consistently been to find some supporting fossil evidence, claim it as proof of evolution, and then ignore all the difficulties. Isn't that what we have seen as the tradition of evolution? So science and evolution, in order to be a credible theory, in order to call yourself a scientific model, all the evidence must be examined. And this is not being done. Why? Perhaps to promote evolution, not real science. Now let's go to the final part, the mechanism for change. We've seen the fossil record does not support evolution. But the second line of evidence we have to look at is there some mechanism that could cause all this new information to be added to our DNA? And the two mechanisms evolution talk about are one, natural selection, and second, mutations. Let's look at both of these. How is the evolution model supposed to happen? Evolution and change. First of all, we're supposed to get a beneficial mutation. A beneficial mutation occurs. Then through natural selection, this mutation is selected over all the other existing genes that code for this particular function. Then this mutation must be inherited by the offspring. So the key thing here is, the key we have to understand is, this process must add new information. Just can't have natural selection, just can't have mutations. You have to have something that's going to add new information. Something that's going to say this ape-like creature is going to start walking upright. Add that new information to DNA, say it's capable of doing that. Some new information in DNA, say it's going to look more like a human being than an ape-like creature. All this has to be done through something called information. That is the key. So let's look at natural selection first. Also sometimes referred to, we like to think of it as genetic variation. We have things called genetic variation. God has programmed into every living creature the capability to be slightly different. Dogs, we have over 200 flavors of dogs, but they're all dogs. We have many different varieties of human beings, but we're all one species. Matter of fact, did you know, when I asked this question, how many races are there in the human species? How many races? The answer is one. There's only one race. You know, the Bible uses the word race in only one perspective. It says, run the race to the finish. It never talks about multiple races. It talks about people, nations, people groups, but never about different races. Then I like to ask this question. How many colors are there in the human species? And I do that, and people sit there, and I see them counting on their finger, and then I stop them and say, wait a minute. There's only one color in the human species. It's called melanin. Those who have more genetic capability for that melanin can have a darker shade. Those who have less capability will always be a lighter shade, like myself. I can go out there, sit in the sun all day long, and you know what happens to me? I get very pink and red, and then turn back into my regular color here. I will never get darker, because I don't have all the genetic capability to get darker. Now, natural selection. What do we mean by that? Well, we do believe in natural selection. We see it all the time. Natural selection means our ability to adapt to our environment. It also means survival of the fittest. Those are natural selection. But the question is, can natural selection cause new genetic information to be added? Can it cause one kind of creature to change into another? And the answer is no. Why? Because natural selection only works with existing information. It can only select from what already exists. It never adds anything new. And in most cases, natural selection causes a loss of information, never a gain. Here's what 4 scientists have to say about natural selection. And they state, natural selection can act only on those biological properties that already exist. It cannot create properties in order to meet adaptational needs. In other words, it cannot and does not create new information. Here's Neil Broom in his book, How Blind is the Watchmaker? And he states this about natural selection. I would therefore argue that the very concept of natural selection as defined by the neo-Darwinist is fundamentally flawed. In other words, in our textbooks, we're giving misinformation about how natural selection operates. We're leading our students into the belief that it can cause something new to be added, and it doesn't. It only selects from what already exists. Now, according to the evolutionists, through this natural selection processes, we're supposed to have this mutation that's supposed to benefit us somehow. And then natural selection selects that new beneficial mutation, gets rid of all the harmful ones. Now, this chart we're looking at up here, natural selection mutations. If evolution is true, this is what we should be seeing. The detrimental mutations, the harmful mutations, should be being selected out over time. And we should be selecting only the new beneficial mutations. But is that what is actually happening? The line going down, getting less and less detrimental mutations? No, it is not. When we look at the real data from the Mendelian Inheritance of Man Encyclopedia of Human Genes and Disorders, what we see is that line is going the opposite direction needed for evolution. As of 1999, we had over 11,000 known mutations and disorders in the human species alone. Natural selection is not doing what the evolutionists are telling us. It is going the opposite way. So the actual evidence does not support evolution. But once again, the public does not hear this. That is called deception. Now let's talk about human variation. Now we have groups of people called the Watusis, the Pygmies, the Dwarfism. We have basketball players, Eskimos, the Inuits. And let's take people like Billy Barty, 3'9", famous actor, died several years ago. He's only 3'9". Was he a human being? Yes, he was, 100% human being. Then we have people like Shaquille O'Neal, over 7 foot tall. Is he a human being? Yes, he is. He's a big one. But he's a human being. You see, if we were to find both these people buried together, fossilized, the evolutionists would claim these are two different species. But they're not. You see, God has programmed into us genetic variability, the ability to look very different. And through natural selection, we have the ability to adapt to our environment and look slightly different, but never become some new creature. See, we need to take into account things like genetic variation within a species due to things like age differences, gender, and the gene pool. None of these are taken into account when we find these ancient bones. So natural selection doesn't work for evolution. Let's look at the last possible mechanism, mutations. Now, if natural selection doesn't work and mutations don't work, then what does that mean about evolution? There's no mechanism, and evolution can't be true. There's no known mechanism. Now, what do we know about mutations? Well, we know that there's detrimental mutations. We know there are neutral mutations that don't do much of anything. And we also know there are a few recognized beneficial mutations. Now, what do these mutations do to the species? Well, detrimental mutations cause disease, sickness, and death. So no evolution there, because once you're dead, you can't evolve. What about neutral mutations? Well, there's no change there. No change to the DNA, no new information. So no evolution there. So now we're on the last leg here. Beneficial mutations. Will a beneficial mutation cause evolution? No. You see, it has to be a beneficial mutation that adds information. Now, if we find a beneficial mutation that adds information, does that cause evolution? And the answer is no, because it has to be a beneficial mutation that adds information that's going to code for a morphological change in that creature. See, all three of those have to be there. Now, if you have a beneficial mutation that adds information that changes the morphology, then evolution is possible. But the question is, are there any known or recognized beneficial mutations that have ever added information? Well, let's see what the experts have to say on this. Jonathan Wells, who has a PhD in molecular biology, makes this statement. But there is no evidence that DNA mutations can provide the sorts of variation needed for evolution. And he concludes, there is no evidence for beneficial mutations at the level of macroevolution, but there's also no evidence at the level of what is commonly regarded as microevolution. In other words, there's no known beneficial mutations that have added information. Let's look at another gentleman, Maxim D. Frank Kamenetsky, in his book Unraveling DNA. Now, he's professor at Brown University Center for Advanced Biotechnology and Biomedical Engineering. So he understands something about mutations and DNA. And this is what he has to say. Mutations are rare phenomena, and a simultaneous change of even 2 amino acid residues in one protein is totally unlikely. Now, what he's saying here is, you get a mutation here, you get a mutation over here, that's not going to cause much change. We got to have beneficial related mutations. And he's saying that is very unlikely. And then he goes on to say, one could think, for instance, by constantly changing amino acid one by one, it will eventually be possible to change the entire sequence substantially. And then he says, these minor changes, however, are bound to eventually result in a situation in which the enzyme, the protein there, has ceased to perform its previous function, but has not yet begun its new duties. It is at this point it will be destroyed along with the organism carrying it. Now, here's what he's saying here. Think of this. What we're teaching in our textbooks now is that the dinosaurs didn't die out 65 million years ago. They evolved into birds. That's what's being taught. Well, let's look at this. Based on what we see genetically, here's what he's saying. Here's this dinosaur. After surviving on this planet for about 150 million years, these dinosaurs successfully doing what they do, doing it very well, according to evolutionists, one day decides, I want to be a bird. Well, think of this. In order to change to a bird, what has to happen? Well, first of all, you have to have your scales change into feathers. And you can't just have feathers. You've got to have primary and secondary feathers so you can get some lift. And it's not just feathers. You have to have your whole internal anatomy changed too. Birds and reptiles have very different anatomy. Heart structure is different, circulatory system, almost everything is different, including the bone structure from solid to hollow. But think about this. Here's this reptile. It's got half scales, half feathers. It's evolving from a reptile into a bird. When it's got half scales and half feathers, it can no longer perform its previous duties of trying to escape its predators because now it's got feathers that are a detriment to it. Can't get away. And it can't fly yet, so it becomes food for its predators. Exactly what we know medically, exactly what we know genetically. During all this transition, it can't survive. The feathers become a detriment. And according to evolutionists, their own model, natural selection should get rid of those feathers, so it should never be able to become a bird. Well, let's look at some more here. Lee Spentner, who has his PhD in physics from MIT, also taught information and communications at Johns Hopkins University. And in his book, Not by Chance, he writes this: but in all the reading I've done in the life sciences literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. All point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not increase it. Are we starting to see a pattern here? The pattern we're seeing is evolution does not have a mechanism for change. Here's another gentleman, Ernst Chain, biochemist and Nobel Prize winner, states this: that the development and survival of the fittest is entirely a consequence of chance mutations, or even that nature carries out experiments by trial and error through mutations in order to create living systems better fitted to survive, seems to be a hypothesis based on no evidence. And that is exactly what we're seeing in evolution. It is a claim without the supporting evidence. Here's another gentleman, Ray Bolin, who has a PhD in molecular and cell biology, writes in his book, Creation, Evolution, and Modern Science: we see the apparent inability of mutations truly to contribute to the origin of new structures. The theory of gene duplication in its present form is unable to account for the origin of new genetic information, a must for any theory of evolutionary mechanism. So we've seen scientist after scientist after scientist with tremendous credentials saying there is no mechanism that can cause new information to be added. We've looked at several, and you can go on and on and on. We have Linda Walcott, PhD in genetics, Todd Wood, PhD in genetics, Lane Lester, PhD in genetics, James Allen, PhD in genetics, and on and on. We can see scientist after scientist stating they cannot find one beneficial mutation that ever added information, which is required for evolution. So what we're seeing here, again, is a great claim being made without the supporting evidence. Information is the key. Werner Gitt wrote in his book, In the Beginning Was Information. Now, he's the director of the German Federal Institute of Physics and Technology, also considered to be a top information scientist, and he states this: there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. That should take care of evolution right there. You see, if evolution is true, if evolution of humans from an ape-like ancestor is true, there should be two proof evidences. One, we should find it in the fossil record. We did not find that. We find no factual intermediates. We should also have a mechanism for change, and we've discovered there's also no mechanism for change. So, conclusion. Giuseppe Sermonti, who has his PhD in genetics, kind of brings us to a conclusion here. And he states, Many schools proclaim as a matter without any doubt that man has derived from the African apes. And he says, this is a falsehood which any honest scientist should protest against. It is not balanced teaching. That which science has never demonstrated should be erased from any textbook and from our minds and remembered only as a joke in bad taste. And he concludes, one should also teach people how many hoaxes have been plotted to support the theory of the simian or ape origins of man. That says it all. So what does all this mean? It means this. We must choose, ultimately, between God's word and the deception of evolution. And that deception of evolution started in Genesis 3:5 when it said this. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Folks, that is the foundation for evolution right there. You rule out a creator God, then who becomes God? We do. And that great lie has now become part of many churches today.